This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, sometimes unexpected things change your plans. I was planning on a Monday podcast where we were going to sit here and cover Friday Night SmackDown, in addition to the SummerSlam 94 pay-per-view and the All In show. Probably get some continuation in the Bloodline story. Talk about how much WWE's butchering the push of LA Knight. And that probably would have about covered it. But instead we got this show. And credit where it's due. It's probably one of those instances where you just say, fuck whatever the initial plans were. None of that matters. Let's talk about something more serious. So in a way, I'm kind of glad I decided not to watch Collision, because I had no idea this was going to be the SmackDown that aired on Friday night. I mean, I figured they were going to do something for him, but I didn't expect what was essentially an entire 2-hour tribute show. Of course, you're factoring in the Terry Funk stuff as well. But that's more than okay, because I think this actually warrants a little bit of a lengthy discussion anyway. And I mean, nothing they were going to produce on that SmackDown show in terms of content was going to be any more superior to the material that they featured as the main headline. And for anybody that's been living under a rock, another tragedy struck the wrestling world in the last few days. On Thursday, the news had broken. 24 hours after the Terry Funk passing, not even, word got out on Thursday evening-ish that Wyndham Rotunda, the former Bray Wyatt, had then passed away. And, it's one of those things where you don't even really know how to process it at first. Is it a troll article? Is it another one of those cryptic WWE White Rabbit QR code deals? You're trying to make sense of it. And, the reality eventually kicks in. It is the real deal. And a very sudden health incident, I believe they said a heart attack, Wyndham Rotunda, at the age of 36 years old, is now dead. It's not a work. This is not Bray undercover trying to tease a new gimmick for his evident return. Because unfortunately, well, there won't be a TV return. It was rumored at some point that they were planning on something for him. They had stuff in the works, but no more. And it's actually kind of crazy to think about. I don't really know how many people have taken the time to notice it, but we've gone basically in one calendar year. We've gone from the Bray Wyatt vignettes on social media with the white rabbit and the weird QR code clues, that big tease for his return to the company after he was already let go previously. Here we are a year later. Now he's gone. And what wasn't it, late August, early September last year? when WWE started airing all those Clue segments on TV. Technically, I don't think we actually saw the return until like October. But isn't that kind of eerie to think about? 1 year later, after all that buzz and all that hype behind Bray Wyatt's eventual WWE return, and trust me, if you don't believe me, go back and watch the build-up. Go watch that return angle they shot last fall. The reaction that guy got when he showed up again, like I even remember talking about it. I said, you can't fake something like that. That was a genuine, authentic, joyful reaction. The WWE fans were beyond elated to see this guy back. And, well, I'll go more into the Bray Wyatt stuff later on, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there in case people are quick to forget about things. Because it is easy to forget. Last fall, Bray Wyatt was the central talking point of the wrestling world for about 4 or 5 months. Bigger than Cody, bigger than the Bloodline, bigger than anything or anybody WWE was pushing at the time. Bigger than LA Knight even. Remember that. Bray Wyatt was one of the most talked about performers and talents in wrestling during anybody during that period. It's very weird to think about. And here's another weird thing. The fact that LA Knight was Bray's final opponent in WWE. The only match that Bray wrestled during that whole Uncle Howdy gimmick. And now LA Knight is receiving the Bray Wyatt reception circa fall of 2022. And this universe is really strange. Things tie together in some of the most obscure, unforeseen ways. And while we're on the topic of LA Knight here, by the way, I'm only going to briefly gloss over a handful of things from the SmackDown show. Like I said, all that stuff was subordinate to the actual Bray and Terry material. But LA Knight got a lot of heavy focus on this program. Not only did they give him that promo time, but he actually got to work the main event this week with Finn Balor. And the tribute promo Knight did was really something special, man. And if you didn't see it, I highly encourage you to go out of your way to check it out because, it was a phenomenal promo, but it was also genius with the way he laid it out. Because he acknowledged the history with him and Bray. He talked about how they went to hell and back in their feud. And he did a great job not breaking kayfabe when he talked about the fact that he wasn't going to stand there and pretend like they were the best of friends, but he's mature and professional enough to recognize that there was a lot of good that came out of that feud for LA Knight. If you really think about it, and again, not to get too philosophical or dark here, but if we're going to be real here, the LA Knight Bray Wyatt stuff didn't happen that long ago. But if you all remember, the reason Knight garnered so much attention coming out of that Bray program was that the people kind of generated disgust heat with the way WWE was punking him out during that feud. Like the fans were just starting to take to Knight, and when they found out that he was basically getting served up to Bray on a silver platter, I think a lot of fans resented that. Because even if the people loved Bray, they also understood what was going on. That Knight was being used as job fodder to get over the new Bray Uncle Howdy gimmick. So it did a lot of good for LA Knight in the sense that when it was over, the people got even more behind him as a result. But again, see, this is where LA Knight understands the business. This is where he has a good grasp on the concept of what professional wrestling is supposed to be. It doesn't matter if him and Bray were good friends behind the scenes. You don't need to air that out. He's not going to go out there and break the fourth wall blatantly. He's still the brash, extroverted, outspoken LA Knight. And he ties things together perfectly when he transitions over to talking about The Miz. You know, Miz did that pre-tape on TMZ calling out Knight again. And now Knight is fed up with his bullshit. He's sick of the trash talking. He's done with the mind games. He wants The Miz in the ring so they can settle their score face-to-face, man-to-man. And right before they pitch to the final match in the program, he gives Bray one last tribute when he said, "There's one thing a wise man told him the last time LA Knight encountered a dangerous human being. Run." And of course, that perfectly segued into the Balor match. And it was a solid main event. It's not a memorable match or anything. Just an easy way to give LA Knight a win. Try to keep his momentum moving. And then set the motion for his eventual match with The Miz at Payback. At this point, I believe the only match that's been announced for that card. Take that for what it's worth. And Pittsburgh fans are about to get the stiff arm if they actually bought a ticket to see that show live. I didn't even have to think twice about it. I mean, I love me some LA Knight, but even he's not enough to get me to want to pay full ticket price for a bunch of thrown-together last-minute matches. What do they think this is, an AEW pay-per-view? But I would say the last 20 minutes of the show were probably the peak in terms of the actual in-ring product we saw this week. The Cody Rhodes promo earlier on where he paid tribute to Terry and Bray, that was more or less a good promo that I don't think really connected with the fans like he had intended. Like, he had a nice theme in mind with trying to explain the history of the business and how the boys used to be referred to as a lot of different things: wrestlers, superstars, performers, artists, what have you. All the different terminology, and we can argue over which one should be stated more often than not. But there were two things that perfectly illustrated the kinds of talents that Bray and Terry were. They were cowboys, which was an interesting choice of terms. I think it would have resonated better if he would have referred to them as something like a legend or an icon. I don't know. I don't think the cowboy moniker clicked like he thought it would. At least not with this fan base, it didn't. But I like the story he told about being at the airport with his dad. You know, Terry Funk showing up and calling Dusty an egg-sucking dog. It's some of those classic wrestling things that you just hear time and time again and never forget. I could do the accent, but, well, you get the point. But it goes to show how, even back then, the boys were so careful to stay in character no matter where they were. God, especially in public places like the airport, you had hundreds and hundreds of people in the surrounding area. I mean, you really didn't know who was smartened up and who wasn't. But Cody's promo was more or less a pitch to what happened afterwards. And I will say, not that I was paying all that close attention to it, because there was no rhyme or reason for the match to happen anyway. But the whole setup Cody did for the Hardcore Rules tag match with the Brutes and the Street Profits, I thought that was so dumb. And that's not even a knock on Terry Funk. We all know about the history of him as a hardcore wrestler throughout the late 90s, the stuff he did in Japan. That's all well established. But the problem, I think, relates back to what I literally just talked about on the Friday podcast about modern plunder matches in wrestling. The whole idea of no DQ, anything goes, hardcore rules, where it's just guys hitting each other with gimmicks for 10 plus minutes and there's no meaning behind it. I mean, that's basically what this was. It sucked. I mean, I can hardly call it a hardcore match. What do we have, like one table bump in the entire thing? Guess we'd have to call that a hardly core match then. It's probably what I'm going to start referring to them all as. But like, of all the ways to pay tribute to Terry, really? That's how you're going to celebrate it? Sending out the boys to do phony hardcore wrestling? Come on. I mean, there were better ways to pay homage to Terry's career, and that was not it. That was probably the one thing on the show I would say that I actively hated. And then Michael Cole having the balls to say, Terry Funk would be proud. Fuck you. No, he wouldn't. He'd have been actively mocking something like that, because it sucked. But let me sort of round this discussion out by going back to the Bray topic, because I've kind of been going around in circles here, trying to half recap the show and then half talk about the tribute stuff. I haven't really taken the opportunity to share my personal opinion on it. And this is where the conversation gets a little tough for me. If you watch the channel for the last year or so, you've heard my comments about Bray. You've heard my reviews. They're up on the channel. And for what it's worth, a lot of those comments I've directed toward the Bray persona, I stand by a lot of what I said. You know, we've traveled the ups and downs of Bray's career in WWE, and while there have certainly been a lot of ups for him, there have been plenty of downs, probably a lot more downs if we're trying to be really honest. And while I can easily sit here and break down the particulars of things I've hated about the booking of Bray Wyatt, all the ways WWE's gone about fucking up the character in some form or fashion, it's probably not in good taste to talk about that in great detail. I have my opinions. You've heard them. You can go rewatch them on the channel in your leisure time. Let's try to focus the conversation on Wyndham Rotunda. You know, whether it's the Fiend, the Uncle Howdy gimmick, the Eater of Worlds, whatever Bray persona or gimmick you want to talk about. The one thing I've always said about Bray is that he was always a captivating figure on camera. Much like how I've talked about The Undertaker being one of those on-camera personas where I watched him growing up as a kid, regardless of the good or bad stuff he was involved with, you couldn't help but just be captivated by everything you saw him do on screen. And Bray Wyatt had that ability to grip you with the material he was doing. Again, I wasn't a fan of everything they did with him. And it's kind of similar to the things I talk about with The Undertaker. And I'll probably go a little more in depth with that when we talk about the SummerSlam 94 pay-per-view later on in the show today. You know, as much of a mark and impact he left on the business, for all the good things Taker contributed to the industry, he was also involved in a lot of bad shit too. And it's okay to acknowledge that. Bray Wyatt was not as clean as the driven snow when it came to the stuff he was involved with on TV. A lot of his booking was shit. A lot of his matches were terrible. A lot of the hocus pocus stuff he did kind of stretched the boundaries of believability in more ways than one. And WWE never really did him favors in a lot of those departments. Constantly having him lose major important blow-off matches when he needed to win. A lot of his segments being very hokey and cartoonish, to the point where it became very hard to suspend your disbelief at times. Again, it's hard to talk about because the guy's no longer with us. It's a tragic, horrible thing that happened to him. But at the same time, I'm not going to go against my better judgment and rescind every comment I've made about the on-screen Bray character. I'm not talking about Wyndham Rotunda. I'm talking about the Bray Wyatt gimmick or character, what we saw of him on television. Even if I love the debut they did for him at that SummerSlam pay-per-view years ago, the Fiend gimmick, the mask, the entrance, everything surrounding the aura of it, that was great. But a lot of the stuff that followed was abysmal. The Cell match with Seth, the Firefly Funhouse sketches, a lot of the stuff he was doing during the Scamdemic era, all those cinematic matches he was having. I mean, I wasn't even watching during that time, but I remember a lot of people are shitting on those segments. Even if it wasn't solely the fault of Bray, the fact that he was involved in so much of it, how do you process that now? The same people that were bearing all that hot garbage, because let's be blunt, it was a lot of it. But those same people are now going to sit here and pretend like all of it was good? No. It's okay, people. We don't have to pretend. It was bad. We can own it. And quite frankly, WWE needs to own it. So those are my thoughts on Bray. Now let's talk about Wyndham Rotunda. Probably the only time we actually saw Wyndham Rotunda on camera during a WWE segment. I think probably one of my favorite things I've ever seen him do. The return promo last year on SmackDown, where he came out and talked about how this was just him. No gimmicks, no strings attached, no masks, no hocus pocus BS. He just wanted to come out and be himself for a few minutes, to talk to the people as himself. Because, well, maybe it was a sign. Maybe he knew somewhere deep down, if he is a faithful man. I have no evidence of such, but part of me thinks he was. Maybe he knew that something was wrong. Maybe he knew that things were winding down for him. And maybe he knew that this would be his one and only chance to speak to the people as Wyndham Rotunda, to let us know the kind of man he was. So, sure, even if he was breaking kayfabe, it's a rare moment where you look back and realize it was justified. You know, they always say hindsight is 20/20. I remember that promo vividly. I forget a lot of things in wrestling, especially modern wrestling, because so much of it is shit now. I didn't forget that promo. His comments about losing a lot of important people in his life over the previous couple years. Obviously, he was talking about the Brody Lee thing. I think that hit him hard. I don't think Bray ever fully recovered from that. Of course, I was right around the same time that we heard about Barry Windham's health, the severe health scare he had. I think it was a heart attack too, right? You know, Bray was still trying to get over that. He talked in that promo about losing his self-confidence, how he had a lot of mental and physical health issues he was dealing with, but even through all that, something kept that fire burning. And it was the people, the fans, that gave him that warm welcome back reception. And, you know, he talked about how the people, the fans, they were the ones that saved his life. He had nowhere else to turn or go. But during Bray's time of need, when he needed the people to support him the most, they were there for him. And it's unfortunate because it's one of those promos where you don't think too much of it at the time when it happens. You think, it's part of a story. And at the time, maybe it was. In fact, if I go back and listen to it again, it probably was part of the Uncle Howdy story. I don't remember how that segment concluded, but those little snippets that you remember here and there, those were the parts that stood out. But then again, it doesn't mean that there wasn't an added sense of realism to it. There were some very cryptic things that Bray said during that promo that stuck with me. 12 months later, I think back, I still remember that heartfelt message he talked about with the fans, thanking everybody for sticking with him and not giving up on him. And I still remember that massive pop he got when he came back. You can't work a reaction like that. Not even close. There was no artificial canned heat to pump up that return. What you heard in that venue at the time, that was a real reaction. And again, even if a lot of the Uncle Howdy shit was terrible and over the top, it is kind of remarkable to think. We never really found out who Uncle Howdy was, did we? Who was Uncle Howdy? Was it Bo? Was it Bray doing another split persona? Or, getting metaphysical here for a minute, was it Bray's maker? I don't think I'm what you would call an active religious fanatic. I think I've always been naturally kind of spiritual. And I grew up in the church. I've had my battles over the years trying to figure out what exactly the supreme higher power is in my life. I still don't really know. But I think Wyndham knew. And, even though they said it was a heart attack that was the cause of death, and I'm not denying it was, there's something that's telling me that there's more to the story that we're not being told. I'm not suggesting or implying that Wyndham took his life, because it doesn't sound like something he would do. He's got a family. He's got kids. He seemed like a natural, down-to-earth, faithful man. I'm thinking he had a lot more emotional scarring from what we were hearing. And, there were a lot of things that happened in the last few years of his life that sort of bubbled up. The Brody death, Barry Windham's health scare, losing his job during the period where WWE was going through all those major cost cuttings, really not having a whole lot to fall back on. Again, yeah, he had his family, but he didn't really have a purpose. WWE was his purpose. The fans were his purpose. And for a period of time, he had that taken away from him. But then he got it back. And a part of him was truly saved the day Hunter re-signed him and brought him back in the fall of last year. Probably one of the better decisions Hunter's made in terms of bringing back talent. All those people that got laid off, and Triple H was kind of going through the records and trying to find out, well, who's worth the financial investment? Bray was probably one of the more important people that he brought back. And, unfortunately, things didn't really turn out as they probably planned. Of course, earlier this year, we heard about him getting COVID. That basically killed all the WrestleMania plans they had slated for him. And we heard other things too. There were apparently some ongoing creative differences happening. Whatever was going on there, I think a lot of that stifled Bray's confidence again, realizing that he was losing the fan interest. Of course, I have my own opinions on the jab, which I'm not going to go into detail about because of YouTube. Don't want my video being flagged for wrongthink. But I do remember talking about when Bray Wyatt came back and did that promo, he wasn't in the best physical shape. And Bray was never what you would call a physically built specimen. He was always a bigger guy, never really had a great physique. There weren't too many instances during his career where we saw him without a shirt on, and there was probably a reason for that. I don't know what his medical history was prior to the vaccinations, but you could put two and two together if you bother to do your own research. But here we are now. Probably a little under a year removed from Bray's actual return. The one-time instance where we actually got to see Wyndham Rotunda on camera, just being himself. And for better or worse, it was probably the most notable thing he did during that short final run. And again, it's hard to explain. Did he ask to go out on television and just be himself for a minute? Did the company push for it? Who knows? But I think it was the exact promo we needed to hear at the time. And for that, it's a memory that I think needs to be continued and shared. You know, it's fine to go back and relive the various incarnations of Bray's persona, and they showed that throughout the program. But that Wyndham Rotunda return promo last year, that's where my immediate attention goes to. And, you know, obviously my heart goes out to his wife, his kids, his family, any close friends or relatives of Bray personally. I think Eric Rowan was out there during the 10 bell salute at the beginning. Braun Strowman, can't remember if he was there or not. But I know those two were very close friends of Bray. I don't think we saw Bo Dallas on camera. Alexa Bliss, I know she was heavily interacting with Bray on TV at one point when he was doing the Fiend thing. You know, the people that got to work with him closely during his run. It's kind of astonishing to think about. Oh, and here's another thing too. Think about all the big names that Bray got to work with during his full-time run years ago. You know, John Cena, Undertaker, The Rock, Roman Reigns, Goldberg. I'm probably missing a few now that I'm trying to recall things off the top of my head. Randy Orton. Who else? I'm trying to think of like more active people, but Bryan Danielson, CM Punk. Yeah. We all forget. Bray was still around when Punk was on a full-time employee status with WWE. God, isn't that weird to think about? The Wyatt family stuff. The very early incarnations of that group. Bray was involved in a lot of key integral things during his tenure. And again, some of them good, a lot of bad. But Bray was the kind of guy that always left a mark on what he was doing. He never half-assed anything he was involved with. Whether it was the wacky funhouse sketches with the puppets, you know, a lot of which I hated, or the semi-shoot promo he did in the fall of last year talking about his personal trials and tribulations. It's all memorable. You don't forget that kind of stuff. The Fiend debut, I'll never forget that. The Wyatt family stuff with Danielson, probably the best match I ever saw Bray have in WWE. That match with Danielson years ago where they tore the house down together. God, when was that? Was that like the Royal Rumble or WrestleMania one year? Can't even remember. It was a lot of peaks and valleys for Wyndham's wrestling career. And again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse with his talking point, but I can't pretend like everything he did was sunshine and rainbows, because it wasn't. And I think even the most hardcore Bray Wyatt fanatic would agree with that. But an unforgettable career? An impactful career? Absolutely. And man, I mean, you listen to people talk about him on social media, the talents and the workers that he got to work with, you know, they're all heavily active talking about Bray and talking about the kind of guy he was. Very personable man, an honorable man. That goes a long way. You know, it's hard in the professional wrestling business because some people have very stifling careers. It's not that I really want to bring up the name because I know it's a very polarizing topic, but this is not a Chris Benoit situation. This is different. I've not heard one person speak ill of Bray Wyatt, Wyndham Rotunda as a man. He just seems like a very down-to-earth, likable human being. And it means something. You take it for granted when they're alive, but when they're gone, it hits you hard. And I think that's why the Brody Lee tragedy kind of struck the wrestling world in more ways than one. You know, I had my personal opinions about what AEW was doing with him on camera, but whether he was Luke Harper, Brody Lee, didn't matter. Whatever his real name was, I can't remember. Was it John Huber? I think that was it. But he was the same kind of guy. He meant something to the people he worked with. And Wyndham was that exact kind of person. So, yeah, like I said, he had a legacy. He made his wrestling career count. Through the good, bad, and the ugly. So, Godspeed to Wyndham. Godspeed to his family and friends. A truly special, unique, one-of-a-kind man. And he will be greatly missed. All right. So I got a late jump on this on Friday night. But since we did not have a Retro Raw to review this week, I didn't mind devoting my entire Friday evening to sitting down and watching this thing. SummerSlam 1994. It has been a minute since I've gone back and seen this show entirely. And it only took me approximately 5 hours to find it on Peacock. I found out it was Season 7 that I was looking for. God, the streaming platform is so stupid. Who actually thought it would be a good idea to title WWF pay-per-views by season? What planet are these fucking morons living on? Like it's the fucking Office or Family Guy. Yeah, we'll just title everything by season. Wrestling fans will pick up on it. Because that's how they talked about every pay-per-view back in the 90s. Vince welcomed us to every SummerSlam show by saying, "It's SummerSlam Season 7, Episode 1. Peons. Speaking of peons, guess who was on color for this one? Good old Jerry the King Lawler. Yeah, him and Vince in the booth together, calling a full 3-hour length pay-per-view. The epitome of oil and water as a commentary unit. Somehow they managed to get through this without ripping each other's voice box out. But, well, I don't know if I've actually mentioned this yet in the build-up to the show. Maybe in passing it came up. But this event did take place at the United Center in Chicago. Oddly enough, the same place that AEW is about to host the All Out show next weekend. The date was Monday, August 29th, 1994, which explained why we did not have an episode of Retro Raw air this week. A jam-packed building with 23,000 fans in attendance. Whether or not those numbers were inflated, who really knows? I don't care because I'm not Dave Meltzer. Nor do I care about the buy rate the show did. We did, however, get word right before the opening match. The Head Shrinkers had previously dropped the WWF tag straps to Shawn Michaels and Diesel. I believe at a house show in Indianapolis. Which brings Diesel up to currently holding both the Intercontinental and WWF tag titles. And within a matter of 2 months from there, soon to be the WWF World Champion. To say they were giving Kevin Nash the rocket ship push at this period in 1994, that would be underselling it. And for the record, if you were to ask me, who were the WWF Tag Champions prior to them dropping the straps to Diesel and Shawn? I don't think I'd have been able to tell you. I vaguely recall the thing with the head shrinkers and the Quebecers earlier this year. The program with Captain Lou Albano and Johnny Polo that sort of escalated that program. Since the point the head shrinkers actually beat them for the belts, I don't recall one single title defense they ever had on TV. I don't even know if they defended the belts more than once. So the title switch meant absolutely nothing anyway. But it was all a lead into the opening match on the card here for SummerSlam 94. Another prelim match that I had no memory of ever happening. It's the Head Shrinkers versus IRS and Bam Bam Bigelow in a completely random Raw TV match. Vince and Lawler spent almost the entirety of the match trying to translate Samoan, because they thought that would be comedy. Generally, for a match consisting of mostly bigger guys, it wasn't bad. Honestly, the weakest worker in the match was Rotunda, and he was the smallest of the four guys. It was very fast-moving for a lot of it. The crowd was into it. I mean, they weren't setting the world on fire with a tag team clinic or anything, but it was a solid, all-action paced match. And it's, well, as per the story of a lot of things in wrestling history, it's going relatively well, and then we get the finish. And then it totally flatlines and kills the crowd. The Samoans are running wild. They end up hitting IRS with the double team splash. And when they go for the cover, DiBiase has the ref in the other corner. And somewhere in there, Bam Bam dragged out one of the head shrinkers to the floor and threw him into the ring steps. And while that's going on, Albano gets on the apron and tries to jaw jack with Bam Bam, but he eats a right hand, taking one of the worst bumps I've seen on a WWF pay-per-view since the bump Mr. Fuji took at WrestleMania 10 in the main event with Yokozuna and Brett. And from there, I have no idea what happened. Somehow Alpha got involved. He started teeing off on Bam Bam, and that was how they called off the match. So the heels end up winning via DQ. And then we had about 5 minutes of post-match fighting where both teams went up the aisleway, and the referees came out to try and separate them, but it's my favorite trope in wrestling. They fought off. As noted, it was a Raw quality match with a Raw finish, but at least it was short. I have no idea where this match came from. Obviously, Rotunda and Bam Bam were part of the $1 Million Corporation, so it was basically just a way to give them a win. Why they couldn't just beat the Head Shrinkers with a pinfall, I have no clue. But that's all I really have to say about that. That was followed with more hideous Leslie Nielsen acting that I'm not even going to bother addressing. You've seen one of those segments, you've seen them all. He's still searching for The Undertaker. It has been 4 months. Nobody cared from the first vignette. Nobody cares now. So then we go back to the ring for the Women's World title match. Bull Nakano versus Alundra Blaze. Now, these two actually had a match on Raw several weeks back that ended up being a lot better than I expected. It was basically a video game match where they hit a bunch of moves and then did a double count out. So here, they basically said, let's do the same match, but this time we'll have a clean finish. There were very mild USA chants that sort of fizzled out rather quickly. It was a stark contrast to the opening match where the people were actually on their feet most of the time. Here, well, everyone just kind of sat on their hands for a lot of it. Bull just beat on Alundra forever. She took like 80% of the match. I did laugh at the one spot where Alundra was going for a pile driver, and Lawler chimed in by saying, "She can't do that. She'll break Bull's hair." And Vince was sickened by this comment. And they traded some spots back and forth at the end. Bull went up top and missed her seated leg drop again. The same move she tried before where I said, don't ever do that because you'll damage your spinal column. Well, Bull did it again. And she missed. Probably fucked up her back for ages. And about 2 seconds later, Alundra fired back. She clocked Luna on the apron with a right hand, gave Bull a bridging German suplex for the pin. Solid match, good finish. Another pleasant surprise with a women's match on WWF television here in the mid-90s. Dare I say, for the limited time we actually saw the women work during this period, they've ended up dishing out some good material. Now, of course, the entire division consisted of 3 people by this point, so they had plenty of time to train and work together in the ring. I don't really know why Luna was out there. She was just kind of in Bull's corner because, I don't know, they're heels. Don't really know if that was ever explained well on TV, beyond the fact that she and Alundra still hate each other and have history. But, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this match. Wasn't blowaway. It's not something you were ever going to remember 6 months after it happened, but definitely something I think gets overlooked a little bit when you think back to the SummerSlam 94 card. The Bull Nakano Alundra Blaze program. This is actually a pretty good little women's program for the time. They had decent chemistry together. The matches were solid. I don't really know how this falls under the radar so much, but God, in comparison to a lot of the other crap going on around this point in 94, this is a rare gem. I don't know if it ever goes anywhere from here. I mean, the women were such a sporadic thing in WWF during this time. And Alundra ends up leaving the company in about a year's time anyway, so she can show up on Nitro and dump the belt in the trash can. Call it a hunch. I'm presuming there's not much of an uptick from here. And from there, well, actually before that, we had an interview with Shawn and Diesel prior to the IC title match. And of course, they're sporting their newly won WWF tag belts. Shawn talked about how the Heartbreak Hotel was looking to claim more gold since they are championship material. This is great. Todd Pettingill's standing there rolling his eyes at Shawn the entire time, just totally blowing the whole thing off. So, right as he goes to get Diesel's comments, he says that tonight is not a tag team title match. And Shawn perfectly retorts with, duh, pinhead. And Todd, in probably the best moment of his entire wrestling career, turns over his shoulder to look at Shawn with such repulsion. Just thinking to himself, this fucking piece of shit. And Shawn played it off so well. And then Diesel said there's no way Razor is going to win gold tonight because Diesel and Shawn like where they are right now. On top. That was a direct quote. Confirmed. Shawn and Diesel like being together on top. Let me write that one down for future reference. Oh, and then they plug something with Walter Payton for the next match. I really wasn't paying all that close attention. I had no idea who Walter Payton was, nor did I care at the time. Some football player. Played on the Chicago football team for like 10 years prior and somehow was still relevant in 1994. But he was a big name, I guess. So then we go back to the ring for Diesel versus Razor for the Intercontinental Championship. As I've said a handful of times now during the Retro Raw reports, I have no memory of this title match, despite the fact that it's Razor versus Diesel, with Shawn involved. 3 core members of the Clique. Totally escaped my mind. I mean, I think they were mostly just using this match to get their obligatory celebrity plug in. Because, I mean, they had Walter in Razor's corner out here throughout the match. For Christ knows what reason. Other than to hammer it into everybody's brain that Razor Ramon was the babyface in this match. And I think Vince had the perfect description of this match before either guy even locked horns. Probably the first and only time I've ever heard Vince use this term. He called this a humdinger. Humdinger. Boy, you want to talk about outdated terminology. And I think Shawn even saw the writing on the wall early on. He said, you know, this match is totally lifeless. Nobody gives a fuck about anything that's happening in the ring right now. So I'm just going to get involved at every possible turn before Diesel lulls people into a coma with his 53rd consecutive headlock. They did a spot early on where Shawn unhooked the turnbuckle pad so they could do a distraction spot a few minutes later. Diesel ended up throwing Razor back first into the buckle behind Earl's back. The entire time Shawn kept running interference, I kept thinking to myself, is there a reason that Walter Payton is still out there? Isn't he supposed to be the equalizer? Preventing Shawn from getting involved? He's not doing a very effective job. Meanwhile, Diesel's continuing to work over Razor for the heat, seemingly for about an hour. They're trying every smoke and mirrors thing possible just to try to make Nash's shit look remotely watchable. And eventually Razor started making a comeback. He hit Diesel with that Steiner top rope bulldog. The same move that broke Bagwell's neck in WCW several years later. I cringe every time I see somebody try something like that. And Diesel actually bumped the same way to where he came down and landed on top of Razor's arm and upper shoulder. Surprised he didn't get hurt. They eventually do a double down spot with both guys after Shawn's 57th consecutive run-in. The 58th of which happened at the end as Walter began to do a tug-of-war spot for the IC title with Shawn. And while that's going down, Earl starts jaw-jacking with Walter on the floor, which leaves room for Shawn to get into the ring, set up for the sweet chin music on Razor while Diesel had him restrained. And of course, y'all know what that sets up. Razor ducks, Shawn kicks Diesel by accident. He starts overselling and flipping his lid. And while Walter is in hot pursuit of Shawn around the ring, he grabs Shawn by the ankle as he tries to slide in, and Razor drapes the arm over Diesel's chest. 1, 2, 3. New Intercontinental Champion. In what was a glorified 2-on-1 handicap match. And you know, it's one of those things where the match itself was only going to be as good as they could make it, given Diesel's experience level. You know, Shawn was out there working overtime to try to bring some energy to the segment. But it was so ridiculous with all the run-in spots and blatant interference right in front of Hebner's face. Like, there were points where I kept asking, why is this guy not sending Shawn to the locker room? Or just flat out ringing the bell? Calling for a DQ? Because once you get spots where Shawn's climbing up to the ring apron in plain view of God and everybody, why is that allowed? Seriously. It's one thing for Hebner to catch Shawn in the act one time, maybe 2, but 15? I can only suspend my disbelief so much. But some of that was just ridiculous. And like, it wasn't a bad match or anything. They were working around Diesel's weaknesses to the best of their ability. You know, and they did set up the post-match where Diesel was berating Shawn up the aisleway. So that started the split with them, headed into the fall. And of course, we all know where that leads later on. So we will see how more of that unfolds as we go through the Raw shows leading into the fall season. From there, we go back to Todd Pettingill in the locker room, alongside Lex Luger and Tatanka. And the burning question is in, courtesy of the WWF Hotline poll. Did Luger sell out to the $1 Million Corporation? And the results are in. A whopping 54% say yes. In fact, Luger did sell out for DiBiase's crew. Can we take a minute to acknowledge how crazy the 90s were when it came to fan polling? WWF and WCW loved themselves those hotline call-in numbers. They were the popular thing, weren't they? My times have changed. Does anybody even own a landline anymore? I mean, I never participated in these things because I always knew they were fixed, but there were people that did that. There were wrestling fans that called into the hotline number to place a vote. An artificial vote that meant nothing. True passion. That's all I can say about that. Now, Todd initially asked Luger for his opinion on the matter, but he's interrupted by Tatanka. Also, he could basically call Luger a sellout about 50 times in a row. He ran down all the angles in the segments where DiBiase and Luger were in the same room together. All the times where it was clear as day that Luger was in cahoots with DiBiase. And now he's going to go down to the ring and wait to settle the score. And Luger promised that he would wrestle this match alone. Nobody in his corner dictating or calling the shots. He wants to make it known to the world that he, in fact, did not sell out. So, well, then we get the match. A very odd case here on a WWF pay-per-view, where you basically had two quasi-babyfaces going in. There really wasn't a clear-cut definitive heel at first, although that would quickly change by the time the match was over. It would seem my initial judgment was correct. Having completely forgotten everything about the Tatanka Luger sellout story with the $1 Million Corporation, well, now we know why Tatanka's been so insistent that Luger sold out to DiBiase. Because in fact, it was him all along. The traitor. The turncoat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the match. Holy shit, this was horrendous. And before I even dive into anything here, let's pause for a minute and talk about something. Now that we're a year plus into these retro Raw WWF recaps from the mid-90s, can we just take a minute to talk about the fact that 1 calendar year ago, to the day, Lex Luger was main eventing SummerSlam 93 for the WWF Championship. The guy that Vince was pushing hard as the #1 top babyface. Here, 12 months later, this is where Luger was in the pecking order. This mid-card, go-nowhere death program with Tatanka and the $1 Million Corporation. No wonder Luger left the company a year later with such bitter resentment. How could you blame him? This is worse than getting pushed down the card. This is getting kicked in the balls, slapped across the back of the head, and shoved down the card. it just hit me when I was watching this. Luger went from wrestling for the top belt in the company to now he's involved in the middle of all this hot garbage, doing this wretched program with Tatanka. After they spent about 5 minutes staring at each other and doing weak-looking collar and elbow tie-ups. Then they finally started doing some wrestling spots. Everything looked like it was happening in slow motion. The crowd was deader than a doornail. They had no idea who to cheer for. Like, it wasn't even a split crowd type of situation. They just flat out did not care. And while they're out there having this hideously dull match, here comes DiBiase down the aisleway with a bag full of money. And he runs a distraction spot in the corner while Luger had his back turned. At which point, Tatanka stacked up Luger, beat him via schoolboy. 1, 2, 3. Flatter than a plate full of piss. Again, I reiterate, the same Luger that was main eventing SummerSlam 93 1 year prior against Yokozuna. Now, a year later at SummerSlam 94, he's doing jobs in the middle of the card via schoolboy distraction spots to Tatanka. Ultimate burial treatment. But the madness didn't stop there. Because then Luger gets confrontational with DiBiase. He kicks the money out of his hand, sends it flying into the air. At which point, we had the unthinkable happen. And by that, I mean not in the slightest. In fact, Tatanka blindsides Luger from behind. He proceeds to stomp a mud hole in him. Gives him his Samoan drop finish about 17 times in a row. I believe I counted. The actual post-match beatdown went on for about 5 minutes plus. Tatanka just beat on him. And he 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 beat on him forever. Finally, we get the visual of him and DiBiase hugging. So they were on the same page the whole time. And, yeah. That was the swerve. It was, in fact, Tatanka who was the sellout all along. And he would have gotten away with it, too. And then we get the visual of Tatanka putting Luger in the chicken wing hold and stuffing the $100 bill in his mouth. Just to make sure we beat that heel turn over people's heads enough. Yes, he's a bad guy. We get it. Boy, oh boy. Let me tell you, if there was ever a side-by-side comparison that told the story here, the 1993 visual of Luger at SummerSlam versus the 94 visual, where he's lying there dead on the mat with a piece of green paper shoved down his gullet. Poor guy. Vince should have pissed in his mouth while he was down there. And to think Luger lasted about another year with the company. But hey, we sure turned things around with the next match on the card. What I was looking forward to the most, actually. The Battle of Country versus Rap. Which musical genre is superior? It's Double J Jeff Jarrett versus King Mabel. No, soon to be King Mabel. Now here was just plain old Mabel. Men on a mission Mabel. Without Mo. And, oh yeah, remember when I was talking about how the opening match on this card was a Raw match happening on a SummerSlam pay-per-view? Well, this was even more of a Raw match that was happening on a SummerSlam pay-per-view. But at least we got a clean finish here. It was only somewhat better than I was initially expecting it to be. I was expecting somewhere in the ballpark of foul to rotten. It was merely bad. Double J did a lot of bumping and over-dramatic selling. I did write down at one point, he tried for a diving something off the top rope. I don't even know what the hell he was trying to do. He just came off the rope toward Mabel and didn't make contact. A lot of it was very slow, very plotting, but they kind of had a formula. Jeff would go for something on Mabel, but Mabel would either cut him off with a power move or some type of big splash. Completely at random here, Abe Knuckleball Schwartz made a cameo. Never led to anything. They're in the middle of the heat, and all of a sudden they just pan out to the crowd, and there's Knuckleball Schwartz, just walking around through the crowd with a picket sign. It never factored into the match at all. They had Double J threaten to punch out Oscar on the floor, but Mabel ended up grabbing Jarrett so Oscar could slap Jarrett. Right in plain view of the referee. Somehow that did not lead to the DQ. I guess because it was on the floor and not in the ring, which is complete bullshit. And finally, Mabel missed a big middle rope splash. Jarrett went for a pin, but Mabel powered out. They did a sunset pin attempt off the ropes, but when Mabel tried to do the seated splash onto Jarrett, that failed. And then Jarrett did a sloppy-looking roll-up for the 3. I'm starting to pick up on a pattern with a lot of this SummerSlam card. There really is not a whole lot to say about the majority of these prelim matches. Aside from a few angles or spots here and there, it's all very basic stuff. And now I think I'm starting to recall why my memories of this show are so limited. We were like an hour and a half in by this point. These matches were just flying by. And I really didn't have a whole lot to write about them. Now, of course, we're talking about Mabel versus Jarrett. So, I mean, seriously, what is there to talk about? The same Mabel that's about to become King of the Ring in a year's time. Think about that. 1 year out from now, he's main eventing SummerSlam 95 for the world title. Here at SummerSlam 94, can't even beat Double J in a complete underneath throwaway match on the card that meant nothing. The booking during this time was fascinating. But here at this point in the show, we had 2 matches left on the card with well over an hour left in runtime. And the thought hit me as we were phasing out of the Jarrett Mabel match. How long were the last 2 matches on this fucking show? I mean, I know the Bret Owen Cage match got some time, but did it go 60 minutes? Or was that Taker match longer than I remembered it being? No. If you really think about it, when you factor in the actual Cage match plus all the stuff they did prior, where they took some time to interview the Hart family at ringside ahead of the match, that took up about 45, 50 minutes in total. You had Vincent Lawler out there talking with various members of the Hart family. Stu and Helen were out there. British Bulldog was there, looking like an unkempt hippie school teacher from the 70s. Now, it was at least 2 or 3 years since we saw Davey Boy in the WWF. He still had the long, shaggy hair by this point. The round eyeglasses were a very strange visual. We also had Bruce Hart and Jim Neidhart there. And, no, all those interviews took up about 5 minutes. Maybe even more. Now, they had to stall for time because the crew was trying to assemble the actual cage. Remember, this was back when they actually had to build the cage from scratch. They didn't have that shit hovering over the arena so they could lower it down. Nah, man, this was old school. Now, this took time. We even got the full-length Owen Brett hype package where they showed the entire story from start to finish, dating all the way back to last year's SummerSlam, where the dissension began. The cracks in the Owen heel turn were starting back then. Of course, we get those awesome highlights of the Owen leg kick of doom at the Rumble back in January. All the build up to WrestleMania 10, that instant classic, the King of the Ring stuff, all of which culminates here at SummerSlam 1994. And, well, after they get through all that, we then go to Bret Hart for a backstage interview where he talks about overcoming strep throat, which I have to imagine was not a work at the time. I mean, he sounded a little congested and under the weather here, even for Bret. I mean, I'm not denying he was sick. If Bret did work that cage match overcoming a bad illness, good for him. Because he didn't miss a beat. I never would have known. And he talked about everything that's built to this point with him and Owen. He says that he doesn't hate Owen for what he did, but all that rage and pent-up jealousy has gotten to his head. He's let guys like Neidhart plant the seeds and create that family division. And he wants Owen to know that didn't have to come to this, but the family wants to see this end. And this is the only way they can do it. They have to settle it in the cage. That was more or less the material from Bret here. Just take out all the bumbling of words and the ums and the uhs. Because it is Bret. He was not the most riveting babyface promo. You probably heard me mention that a time or two. But now the time has come. The cage match showdown. Probably what SummerSlam 94 is most remembered for. It's Bret versus Owen. Brother versus brother. For the WWF title. The last two matches on this card are what the show's primarily remembered for. One for positive reasons, the other for negative. This was certainly the positive of the two. And, well, I'll go ahead and get my gripe out of the way first before we actually talk about what went down. I've always hated the escape the cage rules. I think they're dumb. The whole idea that the only way to win a match is to flee from your opponent and climb out of the cage, it never resonated with me. Even as a kid, I always thought that was so weird. I was always a fan of traditional rules of cage matches where it's no way in, no way out, match only wins via pin or submission. Or in the case of Tully and Magnum at Starrcade, the greatest cage match of all time, getting your opponent to scream, "I quit," which Tully Blanchard clearly never did. And I know the escape the cage thing is a WWF concept. It also probably makes for a better environment when Juice is involved, which I know was way out of the equation during this period. When it comes to this match, if there was ever a time to use Vince's favorite term, the seesaw back and forth match, this was definitely the match that exemplified that. And you know, I will at least say this. If they were going to do the escape the cage rules, at least the whole match was built around that one stipulation. It wasn't the modern WWE adaptation to the rules where it's pin, submission, or escape the cage. This one was purely climb out of the cage and win. That's what the entire match was built around from beginning to end. It was a constant back and forth struggle with Owen and Bret finding every possible way to get out of the cage. Each time they would go up, they would get a tad closer to getting their entire bodies over the top of the structure. Or whenever they would try to flee through the door, they would get more of their upper body through the opening. Actually, the spots involving the door were probably my favorite parts of the match. It was mostly during the latter part where Bret and Owen were pulling each other back by their ankles. And I think it was Bret that kept trying to kick Owen away like a fly so he could crawl out to the floor. But Owen would keep cutting him off. And finally, once Bret realized that he wasn't going to be able to thwart Owen, he just rolled back in the ring and started pounding away on him with rights and lefts. I was also a fan of the spot where Bret tried to escape through the door a second time. And Owen, who, mind you, was about halfway across the ring by this point, sees Bret attempting to flee. So he does one of those full body lunges toward Bret and goes, "Fuck you, brother." He grabs a hold of his ankle and tries to pull him back in again. And they're milking the drama of the big photo finish spots. Every time Bret was on the verge of winning, every single woman in the crowd shit her pants. Anytime Owen was about to win, there were mild boos followed by a lot of guys in the crowd cheering. So I think we kind of figured out where the two sexes stood with the Owen-Bret feud. And there were some really nasty bumps these guys were taking here, especially when they were falling off the cage. And they were coming down and landing on the backs of their necks, upper shoulders. There were periods where they were trying to do the rope crotch spot. But the problem was, because the cage was only 15 feet off the ring mat, there wasn't a big distance from the side of the cage to the actual mat. So if they would crotch themselves intentionally, they would also end up smashing their knees on the ground. Or sometimes they would roll their ankle on the landings. It looked brutal at times. Like, how in the fuck neither guy got severely injured in this match, I will never know. But again, here's the thing that made it work. Aside from the emphasis on both guys trying to get out of the cage at every turn, it was a total sprint from beginning to end. It never bogged down. They kept the action moving the entire time. Yes, there was ebb and flow where both guys would stay down to sell a move, but there was never any major downtime here. It was bam, 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 high energy the whole time, factoring in both guys' cardio. I mean, it's Owen and Bret, for God's sake. You knew they were going to be able to make that work. And it was a long match, too. How long did it go? Some like 30, 31 minutes? That's the amazing thing about it being a total sprint match. It's one thing to do an all-action packed match for 5 or 6 minutes. These guys went well over a half hour. They never got tired. The crowd was totally with it from beginning to end. Of course, we get that awesome visual where Owen and Bret are hanging out over the side of the cage. They're trying to ram each other's head into the cage. And finally, Bret gets Owen to slip and trap his knees in the grating so he could drop down. Meanwhile, poor Owen's hanging there upside down, still trying to reach out and grab Bret by his hair. Such an awesome moment. And, of course, there's all the stuff that happened afterwards, which I had very little memory of ever happening. But there was an afterbirth. You get Neidhart jumping Bulldog from behind, because they were sitting parallel to each other in the crowd. Neidhart was behind Bulldog, so after the bell rang, he blindsided Bulldog and sent him flying over the guardrail. Also taking out his wife in the process, which definitely looked worked. Although that was a very sketchy bump she took. Few inches to the right and she would have clashed right into the ring steps. And that would have been the end of Diana Smith as we knew it. And while the referees and EMTs were attending to them on the floor, we get the classic only in wrestling moment where Neidhart tries to chain the cage door shut with a padlock. But of course, the padlock does not function properly. So while Owen's in there stomping on Brett for like an hour, Neidhart's over in the corner finagling with his fucking padlock, still not cooperating with him. So finally he just goes, fuck, right in plain view of the floor cam. I'm laughing my ass off the entire time. It's train wreck level wrestling, and I love it. Finally, they get the cage door locked, and the Hart family's trying to scale from outside the cage to get in, but they're getting fended off by Owen and Neidhart. And eventually, Bulldog's able to fight off Owen. They chase the heels out of the cage like scolded dogs. We get that awesome split screen with Owen and Neidhart storming off through the back while Todd's trying to interview them with a malfunctioning microphone. And they eventually get the audio issue sorted out. And Owen cut the heat promo and told Brett that he had him beat. Tells Bulldog to keep his nose out of his business. And, Neidhart also shouted some obscenities here. I believe a goddamn was dropped. Vince was very quick to stir the conversation in another direction. And then we see the babyfaces helping Brett to the back through the curtain. I also can't neglect Owen's comment right before they left where he said, quote, Neidhart, let's go celebrate my victory. Because of course Owen was that delusional to think he actually won the fucking match. Did you really think he wouldn't be? God, this is classic. And you know, I'll kind of leave it at this. Even if I personally never liked the WWF cage match layout, I will not deny this match still holds up. I think at the time Meltzer gave it 5 stars. Not that I take his rating system seriously because, I mean, for God's sake, look at how he rates AEW matches. Is this a 5-star cage match? I mean, in the scope of WWE cage matches, most definitely. It may be the greatest WWF WWE cage match of all time. Certainly top 3. I mean, I guess if we're counting cell matches, that's a different conversation. I might have to think a little harder on that. Yeah, because Shawn and Taker was pretty damn great too. I'll put it this way. Yes, cage matches typically serve better in wrestling when there's blood involved. It's kind of the art of what makes cage match stipulations work. You know, the visual, the brutality, seeing guys with open cuts and getting their faces rammed into the side of the cage in a worked capacity. Like, I mean, you want to buy that it's a barbaric environment, and it's really hard to do that when you don't have juice. With that all said, Owen and Brett made this work, and I'll tell you why. The idea behind everything in the match was 2 brothers trying to settle a heated issue. Who was the better worker? Owen was the jealous younger brother that always thought that Brett stepped on his shadow and held him down. Brett's the older brother that never wanted things to boil over to this point, but the issues become so personal that this is the only way to settle it. It's not in the dungeon, as Brett noted during his earlier promo, but it's a dungeon-like environment. In a way, yeah, you could argue that blood would have made it more dramatic. The idea of filming the Hart family's reaction to ringside while Owen smashing Bret's bloody face into the side of the cage. But the question is, did the match really need all that? And I think for the story they told here, everything that led up to this point between both brothers, this is a textbook example of doing a physical, hard-hitting match, but not needing to revert to blood. It was not a necessity. Would it have added to the match? Sure. But did they need it? I would argue no. And that's really kind of the genius behind everything in this match. The fact that they could do a WWF-style cage match and not have to utilize all previous tools that made cage matches so famous. The blood, the gore, the violence. It was a rare WWF twist on a stipulation that actually kind of worked in their favor for a change. They didn't completely kill the cage gimmick because it was still a brutal match. It just wasn't Tully and Magnum brutal. Or the War Games type of cage match where it's just constant carnage and bodies getting laid out the entire time. It was different. Owen and Bret had a physical ground and pound wrestling match, just within the confines of a cage. It's hard to explain, but it worked. It absolutely did. It was absolutely the best match on this card, hands down. And man, it's tough when you look back, but arguably the best match of 1994. Either that one or the WrestleMania 10 match with Owen and Bret. I always had fonder memories of the Mania match personally. Just the fact that it was in the Garden, it was the first encounter between the two. It was something that you never really thought you would see. But anybody that wants to argue the cage match was better, hey, I'm certainly not going to debate them on it. And, you all know me, the bearer of bad news, but it's just kind of unfortunate where coming out of all this, yeah, the feud continues through the remainder of the year. I believe these two end up having one final match together. I think Bret ends up going over clean. And that pretty much ends the Bret-Owen feud in the WWF. From there, Owen kind of got pushed into the mid-card. Bret stayed in the main event picture through 97, but the story with these two kind of peaked here. The rubber match, if you even want to call it that, it ends up kind of getting lost in the shuffle. And I don't really know what the reason was for Vince not really giving this a proper culmination. The feud just kind of fizzled out. And then it was on to Bret working feuds with Diesel and Backlund. Pretty soon Steve Austin and Shawn. Owen, I always forget where he goes from here. The Yokozuna pairing is coming up pretty soon, right? Don't they end up winning the tag titles headed into 95? Or did I just dream that happened? Well, in any case, it was a step down for both guys creatively. That wasn't until Bret started entering the feud with Steve Austin in 96, and things turned around for him again. You know where things didn't turn around? The main event. Somehow, some way, someone thought it would be a good idea to semi-main the cage match with Owen and Bret. Arguably the best cage match in the history of the company. So they could main event SummerSlam 94 with one of the dumbest storylines in the history of the promotion. The Undertaker versus Underfaker story. And this is coming from the biggest taker mark you'll ever find. I hated this fucking storyline in 94. Hated it. Even as a kid, I knew it was stupid. And my God, all that build-up, all those angles and segments they shot, devoting nearly the entire fucking summer to this fiasco. And then we get the actual payoff. The match goes 9 minutes. Perhaps 9 minutes too long when all was said and done. But seriously, I think the promo package beforehand went longer than the actual match. Factor in the ring entrances, then I know it went longer than the actual match. Because, of course, this is the real Undertaker's return. First time back since January, so you knew they were going to milk that for all it was worth. After Brian Lee did his entrance with DiBiase, here comes Paul Bearer with the Druids. And they wheel out the double-wide, double-braced casket. The one that Taker was stuffed inside at the Rumble. I did kind of chuckle at the text printed on top of the lid that read, "Rest in peace," with all the graphics. It's a very nice touch. And they wheel the casket around ringside. They do the slow, dramatic open of the lid. Conveniently, smoke begins to rise out. And in fact, it is not the Undertaker inside the casket. It is merely the urn. And Paul carries the urn into the ring. The lights go out yet again. And now we see this urn cast a giant spotlight throughout the building. We get the ominous thunder and lightning effects. For the record, I can neither confirm nor deny that urns have the capability of flashing lighthouse visuals throughout the top. But let's roll with the punches here. So the anticipation finally culminates as we get the blue and purple lighting in the arena. We see the silhouette of the real Undertaker in the aisleway. I believe the official debut of the classic WWF Undertaker theme. That wasn't just the droning organ chords. No, we actually got the full melodic line playing too. And, speaking of debuts, I think this is our first time seeing the black and purple ring gear. Because they had to separate the black and gray Undertaker from the black and purple real Undertaker. As if the height difference and facial features were not obvious enough. So they do all the pomp and circumstance. Visually, it's very entrancing. Talk about it all the time. It's why I grew up to be the biggest Undertaker fan. Because all this stuff I used to see as a kid, it was so cool. Just the whole presentation of Undertaker's persona. It was all so captivating to me. And I talked about it with the Bray Wyatt thing, but it's kind of why I had a soft spot for him during his earlier run. Just, there was an aura about him that was different from everybody else. And it's kind of the same playing field as The Undertaker. You know, I see this stuff again as I'm older, and it's hard because the jaded, cynical wrestling fan in me is saying, how did you buy all that? How did you not openly laugh at this stuff? Well, it's kind of the art of professional wrestling sometimes, you know? The Undertaker, Mark Calloway, he was the only guy that could pull off this gimmick. I mention it every time. So, yeah, that was all great. Then they rang the bell. I wish I had a ticking time bomb sound drop. Well, instead, I'll just go ahead and give you the Cliff's Notes rundown of what happened here. This match fucking sucked. Everything about it was complete and utter garbage. I remember this being an infamously terrible match. Little did I remember just how terrible it was. If you can just visualize in your head for a minute, if you've ever seen a Bryan Lee match in your day, God bless Jim Cornette. I know he has an eye for talent. He's usually good at calling guys who have more star potential than others. Bryan Lee was not his best discovery. He was, at best, an okay, serviceable professional wrestler. But you take an okay and or a serviceable wrestler who's decently agile, and you put him under a gimmick where he's supposed to pretend to be a zombie and no-sell everything in the book and be stiff as a board. Bad times. That equates to him looking like a bumbling buffoon with 2 left feet. He's out there trying to do this slow, trudging match with Mark. It's horrible. Mark is trying with every fiber of his being to get something passable out of the guy. It's totally not working. And I get the idea is that they were supposed to be working the same style because they're trying to confuse the audience as to which one's the real Undertaker. Again, as if it already wasn't fucking apparent. So they're both doing the zombie sit-ups. They're trying to imitate each other and trade the big spots to keep us questioning who's the real one versus the fake one. But the match is totally dying a death. Nobody in the crowd is reacting. Even Vince pointed out on commentary how ominously quiet the building was. Newsflash, that was not a good thing. And again, it's frustrating because I understand what they were going for. But God, it was so stupid. It was a total Vince idea that backfired in every way imaginable. Poor Undertaker's first match back in 8 months. This is what he's immediately being thrown into. This utter trash. God bless Bryan Lee, but he was way too green to be put in a spot like this. It just totally fell apart the longer it went. The crowd got more and more silent. And the whole thing finally builds to the Undertaker giving the real Taker a tombstone. But Mark does the zombie sit-up. Ted starts shitting his pants in the corner. And as Bryan goes for the second tombstone, Mark reverses that into a tombstone of his own. By the way, sidetrack. Whoever lit the green light for Bryan Lee to give Mark Calloway a tombstone piledriver, I hope they were fired immediately. I wouldn't trust Bryan Lee to give me a body slam, much less a move where he's intentionally dropping me on top of my head from an elevated position. Fuck that noise. I don't know how he didn't kill him. But this was kind of the spot the match was most noted for. Undertaker giving him 3 consecutive tombstones. Gets the win. They stuff Bryan Lee into the casket afterwards. DiBiase goes running for the hills. And they do the post-match celebratory deal where Paul Bearer is reunited with the real Undertaker. It had been settled. They certainly left no doubt. The black and purple Undertaker was the real one all along. Yeah. I certainly can't grade this one on a curve. They could have worked this as a straight match with Mean Mark Callis versus Primetime Brian Lee. Still would have been mediocre at best. Love me some Undertaker. He had some great defining career moments. This was not one of them. In fact, I will go on record by saying this might have been easily top 5 worst. It's this and... God, probably the stuff with him and Khali like 10 years later. Because that was also atrocious. I mean, what do you say about it? They tried to dress it up as much as they could. But once that bell rang, holy shit, did this thing spiral into oblivion. Bad match. One of the worst SummerSlam matches of all time. And you know, it kind of left a bitter mood in the building afterwards. God, I can only imagine what those 23,000 Chicago fans thought. I wonder how many of them are currently living in Chicago right now that bought a ticket to see that show in '94. What do they still think of that shitty main event? How pissed were they? That they witnessed that Owen Brett cage match in person, and then they had to turn around 20 minutes later and witness one of the worst pay-per-view matches in history. I would have been pissed. You kidding? I'd have boycotted every Taker match from then on if I bought a ticket to see this show live at the time. Especially in Chicago. No offense to Chicago residents, but no, fuck that city. It's a real difficult show to grade. Going from that cage match to the main event. I mean, everything else on the card was either mediocre or harmless by comparison. It's just that main event that left a huge stain on the card. You know, I mean, the Luger Tatanka match was also pretty bad, but it wasn't embarrassing. The post-match angle was at least done somewhat well. But man, I can't get over how bad that last match was. Going out on that. And you got the Macho Man trying to put over how awesome the show was. Just fuck off. Seriously. It was a relatively bad pay-per-view that was saved by an all-time classic cage match. That's really the lasting memory of SummerSlam '94. It was a one-hit wonder. A couple okay things to round out the card, but other than that, not a very good show. Not at all. And now we turn our attention to the fall of '94 as we get ready to pick up things headed into Survivor Series and everything else that follows, which are bad times. And if y'all need a precursor of what we're in for, let me leave you with this. Diesel is about to become the WWF champion. Let that simmer for a bit. And now we turn our attention to the big one. AEW All In. Wembley Stadium. We've arrived. We've witnessed it. And now we're here to talk about it. And let me just say from the onset here, boy, does it feel good to say I'm glad that the UK operates under a different time zone than here in the States. I'm telling you, man. Being able to watch a full-length pay-per-view in the middle of the afternoon before sundown, You have no idea how much of a difference that makes. I'm awake. I'm less anxious to go to bed. And when the show's over, I'm not mentally fatigued like I am when we get these 8 p.m. Eastern never-ending trudges. Which I know All Out is going to be next weekend, so I'm preparing to immediately eat my words. But I prefer this pay-per-view model a lot more. It's like when WWE runs internationally on the cock, and I can stream the events at 1 or 2 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, show's over. I can type up my last remaining notes and then eat dinner before the ass crack of dawn. It's good stuff. It's probably why I had a better attitude about this show coming out of it. I'll go over all my thoughts on everything at the very end. But we have much to discuss with this event. So let's go ahead and dive into the card. Or I should preface by saying what I decided to watch of said card. And make sure y'all jot this down for your bookkeeping, because it'll probably never happen again. But yes, I did watch the 0 Hour. Not the whole thing, obviously. You fucking kidding? No, I should clarify. I watched the Adam Cole MJF match with Aussie Open for whatever tag belts they were wrestling for. The Ring of Honor ones, I think. Nobody cares. And, well, I watched it for a couple reasons. A, I knew I wasn't going to be checking out every single match on the card, so I had a little bit of time to spare. And B, I wanted to see what would happen. Wanted to see if they would shoot some angles or tie in some things for the MJF Cole match in the main event later on. The question is, well, what happened? And the answer is pretty much nothing of note. Cole and MJF won the belts, which I don't think was entirely shocking. I kind of suspected that would happen. It's hard to gauge how much the title switch actually meant, because it's the Ring of Honor tag titles. Plus the former champs were Aussie Open. My running joke on the Dynamite reports was me not being able to decipher which one was Aussie and which one was Open. This is probably the best match I've ever seen them have in AEW, which, again, what's that really saying? Watching it in this capacity, in front of all those hot Wembley fans, that I think it ended up being the ultimate difference maker. Had they just blown this off on Dynamite in the States in front of 5,000 or 6,000 fans, would have come off like a wet fart in church. But when Cole and MJF hit their double clothesline finish at the end and then got the win, the people went ballistic for the title change. Whether or not they actually care about the Ring of Honor tag titles, that's another conversation entirely. I think that they were just glad we didn't see the breakup here, because that would have sent things into a tailspin almost from the beginning of the card. Like, you can't open up the main card for the Wembley show when the first thing you see is Adam Cole and MJF losing in the prelim dark match. So you kind of had to do a belt change. How that all would factor into the main event, that was always going to be the catch. It was interesting how they did it, though. Okay, so Cole and MJF win. They have their brief post-celebration in the ring together. Cole's already got possession of the AEW World title within a matter of seconds, and he's doing the thing where he goes to present the belt to Max, and pretty soon after he passes the belt off again, Cole powders, and he leaves on his own. And he kind of had that stewing facial expression, like he like he was going over a plot line in his head. It was a really strange way to transition out of the match. They didn't spend a whole lot of time milking the gravity of the title switch. It was in and out. Cole and MJF win. Cole leaves shortly thereafter. They didn't belabor anything. They didn't even leave together as a team. That was the really weird part. And then it was immediately back to Renee and whoever the other guy was for more 0 hour coverage. I think it was Kip Sabian that was there. I just saw a generic Ken doll looking dude with a British accent. I did catch Paul White there for a brief sec. Forgot all about him. I had no idea he was still under an AEW contract. But in any case, that was pretty much all there was to it. The match itself was totally inconsequential. The only thing that mattered was the finish. But it left us with a nice cliffhanger going into the main card. What happens now? MJF and Cole are still friends, but the next time we see them in the ring together, now they're going to be standing across the ring as foes. And then we go from that to our first match on the card. The ultimate power play from the ring veterans. Whether or not that was a CM Punk call, I don't care. He said, before all the Cucamonga cocksuckers kill the crowd with all their incessant indie bullshit, we're going to have the pro wrestlers go on first. That way they couldn't be held responsible for the lackluster crowd responses later on. For the Real World's Championship, it's CM Punk versus Samoa Joe. Curtain jerking the All-In card. And quite frankly, I don't blame him. Just like Punk at Forbidden Door, he said, I'm going early, I'm getting out, grab my paycheck, and y'all can flounder around with your multi-man bullshit after the fact. I'm going sightseeing in London, brother. Got better places to be. God, the CM Punk dynamic is such a weird visual to wrap my head around. Every time he goes in to work a match, I never know whether or not he's going to be the face or the heel. I wasn't entirely sure where things were going here at first, but I think it's safe to say, by the time Punk started mocking John Cena with the 5-ish moves of doom, it was pretty set in stone that he was a full-fledged heel. The people were already booing him considerably beforehand, but the Cena shit had me rolling. That's like the oldest heel trick in the book. Mocking John Cena on an AEW pay-per-view. That's your ultimate heat magnet right there. What a genius. I even like the Hogan leg drop of doom spot afterwards, which Joe immediately no-sold. And then they mock the Hulk up spot. Like, these guys get it. They get professional wrestling. And that was probably my biggest takeaway by the time it was all over. They understand what wrestling is supposed to be. How to get the most out of doing very little. It's always great watching Joe when he's super motivated. And I don't mean that as a knock on Joe, because he's always great. But if you followed his career, you've seen the periods where he's reined it in. See his entire TNA run post Kurt Angle. This was not TNA Samoa Joe. This was I love my job because I get to work with professionals, Samoa Joe. God, he was awesome here. Same goes with Punk. I'm not trying to downgrade his performance. This was a fantastic opener to the card. It was hard-hitting. It was serious. These guys beat the ever-loving shit out of each other. This is easily the best AEW match I've ever seen out of Joe. And of course, you're going to have the gymnast critics out there that are talking about how it wasn't a fluid, crisp match from start to finish. Now, you know what? Name a fucking modern pro wrestling match in the last 10 years that was perfect or fluid. Even Shawn and Taker at WrestleMania 25 had some botched spots and iffy moments in it. It was still an all-time classic. And here's what I love most about this. Aside from the layout and the structure of everything, which was damn near perfect, I loved how when the match was over, the first thing I thought to myself was, wow, that was really good. And I could have gone for seeing them go a few more minutes. Because it was really kicking. That's how you judge a great pro wrestling match. Not the amount of flips a guy does, not the amount of moves you see, not how many kickouts or counters you see, but that when it's over, you think to yourself, man, I wish it could have gone a hair longer. I was never bored watching it. It flew by. They had a simple story where Punk tried to work the cat and mouse game with Joe. Joe wasn't having any of that. He very quickly took control and just decimated Punk forever. You know, obviously they have each other scouted from previous matches they've had, so they kept all that in mind. But I love the intensity to this. We got Juice here with Punk getting rammed headfirst into the gimmick announce desk. Yeah, we can debate over whether or not they ought to be doing blood in the opening matches on pay-per-views. For this particular feud, I certainly don't think the blood detracted in any way. So I was okay with it. And you know, as far as Punk going over in the end, he hit the Pepsi plunge off the top, clean pin. Obviously, that was the right call. And you factor in what they probably have planned for him and MJF later on. And Punk had to go over. But man, they gave Joe a lot here. And that's why the match works so well. Yes, Punk won. But through the skin of his teeth. He had to work for that victory. I thought both guys came out looking great. You really couldn't ask for much more. These guys delivered on all cylinders. Excellent opening match. Dare I even say, one of the best AEW opening card matches I've seen in their entire history as a promotion. I know that Darby MJF opening card match got rave reviews a couple years ago. I haven't gone back and seen it in a while. But this Joe Punk match may give it a run for its money. And I think JR summed it up perfectly at the end. The wrestling world could use more Samoa Joes and CM Punks. And I fully agree with that sentiment. Especially compared to a lot of the other slapnuts I saw on this card. Speaking of slapnuts, no, Jeff Jarrett was not booked. Thank Christ. But we did get a handful of slapnuts in the next match. In our first of many multi-man clusterfucks on this card, we get the Golden Elite team of Jay White, Juicy Fruit Robinson, and Take a Shit versus the Golden Nut Huggers. That's Hangman Page, Kota Ibushi, and Kenny Omega. I was half tempted to skip this match entirely, just to preserve any respect I still had for Jay White and Juice Robinson beforehand. But they already threw the baby out with the bathwater when Tony booked this match to begin with. So I said, fuck it. What's the worst that could happen? So I never watch a Golden Elite segment on Collision after this. So what? No skin off my back. As per usual, Jim Ross playing the role of me during many portions of this match. Anytime you had random six-ways going on or guys coming in and out with no tags, JR was right there to say, Come on, fucking bald-headed dipshit ref. Count these idiots. DQ them. Something. Or my favorite quote from JR in this match. Who the hell is the legal guy? It was a valid question. Because I couldn't tell at various points. And I paid very close attention to what was happening here. Excalibur's sitting there like a fucking moron. Referee Rick Knox begging and pleading for the wrestlers to obey him. To which JR immediately responds with, then start disqualifying somebody. He has the power to do so. It's his job. That's why he's getting fucking paid. How hard is this? Yet again, JR working the role of me as a color commentator. It's why I can never work a day in the wrestling business. Because this would be my job on every show. Yelling at the marks in the ring to start acting like pro wrestlers. And yes, I use the term marks on purpose, not talents. Because the talent in this match was few and far between. The best compliment I can give a match like this is that there were some okay moments. Ironically enough, the best parts were probably when Juice and Jay were involved. Elsewise, the rest of the action was your prototypical AEW sloppy multi-man match, where everyone's doing a jillion things at once. It's impossible to keep track of who's legal and who's not. There's no enforcement of rules, unless it's convenient to do so. I mean, I really didn't even bother writing down any spots because why bother? What's the point? No one's going to remember a goddamn thing about this match less than 3 weeks from now. I'll probably remember Kenny Omega and Kota Ibushi fucking up their signature double-team moonsault spot in the corner. Apparently one of their Japan spots. And that was all on Ibushi for slipping on the middle turnbuckle and nearly eating shit. That was at least funny. Especially seeing it from the wide shot. Beyond that, the only thing I'll probably be able to recall about this match 6 months from now is JR calling out the boys for all the indie bullshit that was going on. And you know what? I don't care. Call him old. Call him bitter. Call him cynical. He's not fucking wrong. Every comment JR made about nobody following the rules of tag team wrestling here, they were all perfectly valid. Just because you like all the chaos and nonsensical six-way spots that make no sense, it doesn't mean it's the correct way to do it. It's what happens when you don't have agents to format these matches. And you just leave everybody to their own devices, to call their own shit. This is what you get. You get impressive-looking tumbling routines and not a whole lot in the realm of pro wrestling. You also get ill-timed flat finishes that come out of nowhere and completely take the air out of the room. Shocker. It's exactly what happened here. They're all trading stuff back and forth at the end. Everybody's tripping over one another and getting in everybody's way. At one point, it looked like Take a Shit almost came down and landed right on top of Ibushi's ankle. Because he was laying right in the middle of the fucking line of fire during that whole fiasco. And after Omega hit a V-trigger on Jay White in the ropes, Take a Shit just comes in the back door and schoolboys Omega for the pin. Was he the legal guy? Fuck if I remember. By that point, everybody was just in the ring doing whatever they wanted. At that point, I just kind of figured it was tornado rules. Because who even knows? So yeah, that match accomplished nothing and did literally nothing for me. A stark contrast to the opener in just about every way imaginable. And then we go on to the next match on the card. One that I was almost about to chalk up as a no-win situation. At least for one of the parties involved. The writing seemed like it was on the wall for this one. The rubber match between FTR and the Beta Bucks for the AEW World Tag Titles. Especially after hearing about the Cash Wheeler news in the last week. I wasn't giving my hopes up for a miracle here. I totally expected the obvious to happen. I was totally sold on thinking, there's no way the Bucks are losing this match. After everything they've done to sabotage FTR in the last year, after holding off on even doing the rubber match for almost an entire 12 months, them never being able to accept that FTR are and have always been the better tag team, thinking there was no possible way the Bucks would even consider doing the job in Wembley in front of their friends and family. It was unthinkable. Boy, is it during moments like this where I love being wrong. Fuck. I couldn't believe it. They actually did it. They did what was right for business. They put their egos aside. They accepted reality for once in their miserable lives. And they did the job. Clean. No excuses. No poor attempts at finding an outing. Nope. They put FTR over. And more than that, they actually let Cash get the pinfall. Wow. Talk about unexpected twists. If anything, this was the biggest surprise on the entire show for me. Now, whether or not that comes down to this being a Tony call or the Bucks trying to garner sympathy from all the spineless, soft, elite cultists out there, making it seem like, well, we were just doing what we were told, courtesy of the boss. We had no say in the decision. No. We'll see if that story ever breaks. But the fact remains, the right decision was made. I fully expected the Bucks to try and politic their way into going over here. Didn't mean it was ever the right booking call. So, whoever's decision it was, whoever gave this the final stamp of approval, credit to them. And when it comes to the actual match, I mean, it's tough. It was hard for me to grade the match they had last year because while it was still good, I'm also grading on the Bucks scale. Whether or not they tone down the gymnastic antics, they're still going to wrestle a Bucks match no matter what. So you kind of have to go in expecting that. It's a weird, bizarre situation where you've got a clear clash of ring styles. So it's kind of up to one of the two teams to take charge and call the important spots. Elsewise, it's going to fall apart at the seams. FTR can dial up the high spots when necessary, but they're also professional enough to know when the time calls to do the high spots. Much like the Punk match in the opener, though, you're always going to have that weird dichotomy with the Bucks FTR segments. The fans are going to pick and choose who they're going to like, so it's hard to have a clear-cut face versus heel match. The difference between Punk versus Joe and the Bucks versus FTR is that I don't think the Wembley fans were as anti-FTR as they were anti-Punk. You know what I mean? So even if there were more pro-Bucks fans during the match, it wasn't as polarizing. So by and large, FTR worked a more babyface style here. The Bucks were clearly working Cash and Dax over a whole lot more than the other way around. And again, drawing comparisons to the Punk Joe match from earlier, was this a picture-perfect, flawless tag match from bell to bell? No, I wouldn't say that. There were some obvious miscues and missteps along the way. And I'm not just going to hold the Bucks' feet to the fire for that, because FTR were a little out of place during sequences at times. The only major complaint I had here were all the clearly obvious fake forearm exchange spots and the contrived looking setups for all the double team spots. Kind of a mouthful, I know, but anytime both teams were trading double team moves or big sequences, there were parts where I just kept thinking to myself, man, that's really phony looking. And it's okay to plan out double team sequences, but you also need to make sure they come off naturally. And like the spots early on where you had both teams jockeying for a position, watching them throw those weak-ass phony-looking forearms back and forth, barely look like they were connecting at times. That shit never looks good. It doesn't matter who's doing it. Whether it's the elite camp or the punk camp, anybody that throws a worked punch or a strike and can't make it look real, they need to be immediately fined. It's embarrassing how fake everybody's punches and strikes look in today's business. It's ridiculous. Learn how to throw a punch. How hard can that be? That's like first week of wrestling school training. None of these idiots can figure it out. Going back to the match, though, especially by the time they started building up to the finish, you had the spots where both teams were kicking out of each other's moves. Not more than once, because that would have been stupid. But here, in this setting, I was okay with it. The Bucks kicking out of the Shatter Machine the first go-around, that was fine. Pissed me off how Excalibur had to point out that nobody's ever kicked out of FTR's finish until just now. Of course, he had to give the Bucks that achievement. Douchebags. Then later on, FTR kicked out of the double V-trigger spot. And they actually had me with a few of those false finishes toward the end. I mean, there were several points where I was convinced the Bucks had that match won. And it's not a bad thing to work my emotions like that, because it made the actual finish that much more cathartic. And the whole lead up to the Bucks going for the Meltzer driver, but Dax ran in, cut Nick Jackson off at the pass. They chuck Matt out of the ring, and they hit Nick with that really sick-looking big rig for the 3 count. That was a great finish. And I'll give the little bastard credit. Nick Jackson sold the hell out of that move. Again, I was absolutely floored when they had FTR go over. Like, you talk about me being genuinely shocked at a finish to a match. This one. This will probably go down as the biggest shock of 2023. Like, this is a bigger shock to me than Roman beating Cody at WrestleMania this year. Because even in that match, there was a part of me that always kind of figured it was too good to be true. That Cody was going to win the big one and become the top guy. So when he lost, even if I was disappointed, I wasn't all that surprised. This FTR Bucks match, there was 0% of me that ever thought, it is always possible they put FTR over clean with no bullshit. Never crossed my mind. Then it happened. And I was like, oh, fuck. They proved me wrong. Good for them. Good for the Bucks. Glad they did the right thing. And, they didn't shake hands afterwards or embrace anything like that. And I was okay with that too. I complain about this all the time. Way too often we see guys hugging and showing signs of respect after big AEW matches. It wasn't called for here. Like, we know these guys can't stand each other. Yes, they're willing to work together professionally, but we don't need all the gaga. The fake-ass show of respect. Because that's all it would be. It would be fake. If they would have shaken hands after the match and shown signs of respect or whatever, I wouldn't have bought it. And you don't need to pull the wool over our eyes like that. We know what's going on. FTR go for the handshake. The Bucks blow them off. Fine. Good. It's a heel thing for the Bucks to do. And it leaves the window open for FTR to continue their feud with Jay and Juice. If that option's still on the table, the Bucks can go back to playing in their sandbox with all their playmates again. And we'll continue to ride the wave of momentum with FTR as the World Tag Team Champions. Of whatever description. I think they're the actual AEW Tag Champs. Not the Ring of Honor or the AAA or whatever sets of belts are currently being distributed on AEW TV. It's kind of sad how I actually had to think about that for a minute. What set of tag belts does FTR currently have? So here we are. 4 matches into this card, if you count the pre-show. So far,